It's Umar Ali from the upcoming, and I'm here with Jason Loftus, director of Eternal Spring. How are you doing today, Jason?
I'm doing great.
So yeah, to start off with, I guess could you give us a quick rundown of what the film is for people who haven't seen it?
Sure. It's an animated documentary told through the lens of an artist who had to flee his hometown. And it looks at a dramatic heist story, a hijacking of the state TV airwaves by a group of Falun Gong adherents in Northeast China. The story is it's about 20 years now. It's the 20th anniversary of this event. And we're looking at it through the lens of an artist named Dashong, whose his claim to fame is drawing for Justice League and Star Wars. But he's also big in the Chinese comic space as well, and his life was uprooted as a result of this event.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the first things that really sticks out to you when you watch this film is like Dashung's very specific art style. What was it like working with him on this project?
He's a really unique talent. This is something we connected around a kung fu video game we were making a few years ago. That's how we got to know Dashong, and the video game had this kind of we were a visual novel component to it. So we were looking for still art images, and we learned about this guy, and he was drawing for all the big, for DC and Dark Horse and such. And he'd drawn with Jin Yong as well in China, who's the leading kung fu novelist. So we thought he had this like great combination of artistic ability as well as the cultural background. And we started collaborating with him, and that's where we learned his story of why he had to leave. And we also learned that he came from the same hometown as my wife and producing partner, which is this city in Northeast China called Changchun, where the story takes place. But the two of them had a very different experience. So Masha is the daughter of a mid-level government official. She's not part of the Falun Gong community. So hearing what people like Dashong had endured sort of under her nose in her own city really hit home. And I think was one of the motivations for us wanting to explore this story. But Dashong is like, he's someone, I'll give you an example. Like if you drive somewhere with Dashong and you're worried about like, where did you park your car? He's got this like photographic memory. Everything for him is just stored. He remembers everything visually. And he also communicates. It's like, he really has this ability to create a feeling and a vibe. And he talks about this. It's like, with Chinese art, and this is where he draws a lot of his inspiration, even though his artistic style with comic illustrations is very detailed, the Chinese art isn't as much about the details. It's more about conveying a vibe or like a feeling or a sense of something. And you really get both with Dashong's art. You get this like, the details and all the intricacies, the things that he picks up through his memory, but it really has a feeling. It's not about just the iconic buildings that sort of give you the sense of a city. There's a feeling to it that he conjures.
Definitely. Yeah, like I said, the aesthetic is one thing that really stands out to you. It's a very interesting mix of like computer generated animation with this very comic booky art style. It almost gives it a sort of video gamey sort of aesthetic to it. What inspired the specific visuals that went into the film?
So I think it's a combination of things. One is that we had collaborated with Dashong on the video game, and we were looking for ways that we could, in that sense, we were doing 2D art, and then we had some 3D interactive scenes. In that case, it was Kung Fu Combat. And we were looking at like, how can we still maintain like a consistency with Dashong's art style? So we had kind of started to explore in this area a little bit. But when it came to the film, because Dashong is our eyes, he's our lens to this story. He's the one who's got a personal experience, and he's got mixed feelings about this event. He's very sympathetic to the effort of those people who, did the hijacking because they're countering the state narrative that he was also subject to, this sort of hate and misinformation about his faith community that was underpinning a human rights abuse. But at the same time, he's like, was this a good idea? Because the consequence, the human cost was so high. So he's got this kind of mixed feeling. So he's our lens, and we're exploring it through his art. So you can see through his art, the nostalgia and the longing that he has for his home. You can see the pain of torture that he's endured, and like how the artistic process helps him to come to a new understanding. So because that's central to the story, when it comes to the artistic style, the decision very early on with David Saint-Amand, who's our animation director, Yvonne Pinard, who is the producer overseeing the animation pipeline, was we really just wanted the animation to be bringing to life Dashong's art and to just feel like it is a sort of 3D render of Dashong's illustrations. And so what we would do in terms of like how we executed on that is Dashong would do the concepts and, for all of the character models that we were building, and he would storyboard a scene. And what we would do is we would build a scene in Maya, but it would just be a gray box scenario. We'd have a rectangle where a building goes and some lines where the streets are, are going to be sort of demarcated. And then what we would do is we would take images inside the 3D software, but we would do it from different camera angles. And then we would print out those images. And so Dashong just has some basic lines as a constraint for him, right? And then he would draw all of the detail. You know, this is how he remembers Changchun. This is what it felt like for him in this situation. And he would draw all of that, but he was doing it within the confines of these shapes that we had constructed. And because he was doing that for us from different camera angles, we could then scan those images and drape the detailed drawings onto the surfaces in the 3D software. And so this way, now you can move a camera through the space. You're moving it through the space. Everywhere you look, you still see Dashong's 2D illustrations. You still see the detail. It still feels like his art. But as you're moving through it, you now get the benefit of the parallax, right? And the perspective that you have in 3D. And so this is helping us to achieve that goal of like maintaining the authenticity from the 2D artist, but also giving people a sense of place, bringing them into the artist's mind and letting them feel like they're going through his art, his thought process as well. So if you think about the opening of the film, we have this like 5-minute long oneer, a long shot without a single cut. And we were able to achieve that because of the way we built these things. So you're moving through, and this was important because that opening scene is about, you know, the police raids that were happening and Dashong's feeling of just everywhere you turn, there's danger. Everywhere you turn, you could be arrested, right? And so because we built everything in 3D using his illustrations, you can move through and get that sensation that you can basically just travel anywhere in the space and you're immersed in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, one thing I do think was really interesting about document is how much of its production was a part of the story. You know, you get a lot of behind the scenes, you get a lot of sort of storyboards, and you know, you get a lot of insight into the process. What do you think was your greatest creative challenge with this film, and what are you most proud of?
Well, I think you hit on it right there. So this was the thing. I had seen animation used in documentary. I loved Flea, although I didn't see it until after I had finished my work on this one because it's more recent. But there are other films earlier on. Waltz with Bashir is a favorite, and you know, even Tower, which uses kind of rotoscoping method in animation. I just thought that was really cool as well. It was just interesting to see how animation could be used for recreations in documentary. But every one of these films, whenever you see the animation, even when it's done very, very well, it was always this decision by the invisible hand of the director. You know, you don't know who's doing the art, what kind of subjective experiences and decisions are going into that artistic process. It's just there. And this, for me, was an opportunity to pull that curtain back, right? And so we have an artist who's intertwined with the story. So let's find a way to show the artistic process playing out on screen. So seeing him facing all of his trauma, facing his memories, meeting the other survivors, understanding more why these people did what they did, and coming to some new understanding of this event through an artistic process. And so then the artistic process itself and the creative process is part of the narrative. It's part of Dashong's arc. That's how he grows in this sense. And for me, that was something I hadn't seen done on screen. But what it meant was like that we had a real challenge in production, because typically when you shoot a typical documentary, you go out, you shoot 100 hours of footage, you're sitting in the editing suite, you're carving it up and letting the story emerge sort of organically. When you do animation, it's very different because you have to lock your script first. You have a storyboard for every shot, and then you build like an animatic or a Leica reel, which is essentially like a film of storyboards. And so your timing is set. You know everything you're doing before you begin animation because it's very time consuming and expensive. So with our ambition of wanting to show the animation process as part of the documentary that we were shooting, that meant we were still shooting the documentary. We weren't sure exactly how the story would play out. We were observing Dashong. We were observing him creating this art, sharing it with people, processing it all himself, while we were animating scenes that were going to be part of the same film. And so we didn't know where exactly they would fit. We didn't know how we would piece them together. We didn't even know for sure that every one of those scenes was going to land in the movie. So it's a big risk, especially when you're like a small independent production, to be doing something like this. But we just had this feeling that this would allow us to create something new and unique that we hadn't seen before, and to sort of bring people into the artistic process. And I was really interested in exploring the power that art can have, right? I think this is what this film speaks to on one level as well. So, you know, hopefully in the end, it all kind of feels like it ties together, but it was definitely a lot of tension because these two processes are kind of at odds with each other that we were doing at the same time. And actually, to say the way that we would approach it, because, you know, you don't know the whole story and how it's going to play out, but the way that we tackled that was we would start by having Dashong draw things that were personal to him. This was part of getting him warmed up. And this was also part of just like, since we know Dashong's story is part of this, this is the artist's journey, let's just see what he feels and let's just go with that. So there were scenes like that we use later on in the film where he's running from his own paintbrush strokes and these sort of dark memories of these scary images and such that he had endured and witnessed and stuff that was coming up. That was very early on in our creative process with Dashong. He was drawing that, as well as the sequence from the childhood memories from his hometown of what that was, his memories and his longing for his home. That sort of composite scene of all those different, the festivals and the happier times and stuff, that was something very early on. He was missing his home. We just ran with it. We didn't know where it was going to end up in the movie. We didn't know how it was going to piece together, but that was a way for us to start doing some things before we knew how everything was going to be built.
Yeah, so this is your second director credit after Ask No Questions, which kind of touched on similar themes and motifs, but obviously in very different directions. What was the experience of directing Eternal Spring like compared to Ask No Questions?
Yeah, so you're right. It's very different. It was a journalistic investigative documentary, but the subject matter overlaps. And that film actually happened in the middle of this film. So this film was something that we chipped away at for close to 6 years. And I think it's because of the animation involved and all of the things that we were doing. So I started this one first, made the other one in the middle. The other one, without getting into too much, it deals with sort of a deep dive investigation into the Chinese misinformation that underpins the human rights abuses. And it's just one of those things where if you include it in a film like this, it ends up being its own center of gravity and kind of detracts from the efforts that these people were making to counter it. So it just felt like it belonged as its own film. So the two are related, they're overlapping themes, but yes, very different in style and delivery. The other one, it's a journalistic documentary, right? Mm-hmm. So I was a learning process. I feel like I learned through what I had done so far on Eternal Spring when I jumped over to Ask No Questions. And then Ask No Questions, I had a co-director, Eric Petticelli. I came from the producing side, he came from the editing side, and both of us were first-time directors with that film. So we learned a lot from each other, and I was familiar with Falun Gong. He had some, knowledge about the human rights and censorship issues in China, but he was brand new to the subject. So this was an opportunity for us to kind of learn from each other, push each other, ask each other questions. And I think that growth process was really helpful when it came time for me to return to Eternal Spring. I think too, I benefited on Eternal Spring from having we had a small team, but we had a very dedicated, capable team with a lot of passion. So, from the animation director, the animation department is 4 people, which is tiny for a feature film, but a lot of people who really just put a lot of creative energy into what we were doing.
Mm-hmm. What do you hope audiences will take away from this film?
I think there's a few things. One is that it highlights the ongoing issue of, the religious freedom restrictions that exist in China. This is something that's showcased through the persecution of Falun Gong, but is also now being endured by the Uyghur Muslims in the northwest of the country, and very similar sort of echoes of what's happened with Falun Gong. Large numbers of people being imprisoned and interned and compelled and coerced to abandon their beliefs and such. And we see it in the treatment of other groups in China as well. So there's this overarching theme. I think also it's important because the Falun Gong persecution has gone on for quite a while now. We tend to shift our focus to the next new tragedy, and we forget that some of these things, even if we haven't been paying attention to them, may still be happening. So I think it's, I'm pleased to see that on the human rights front, that it's sort of reintroducing that conversation that this is an ongoing human rights concern. And then I think aside from the China-specific human rights issues, I just think there's something universal about this film, and I find it really satisfying when people connect with it, regardless of whether they already have an existing concern or interest in the human rights situation in China. I think this really speaks to the courage that's required to speak out in the face of injustice. And a lot of us, although we seldom face the risk of life and death, we often see something that isn't right or something's wrong, and it often requires courage to speak up. And so I think we can all gain some type of insight and inspiration from the individuals who, in this extreme case, I think demonstrated some really remarkable courage.
Mm-hmm. I can see that we're running low on time, so just to wrap things up, do you think you could sum up the essence of this film in a single sentence for me?
A single sentence. I think Eternal Spring is about both courage and hope in the midst of great adversity. That's really, to me, the spirit of, and I tried to capture that. not just the atrocities and all the difficulties and all of that, but the hope that they maintained despite all that they had endured.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.